Why don't I go ahead and get us started? Does that sound good, Halen and Julia?
Sounds
Tiffany?
Sounds
All
good.
right, let's go. So again, welcome to Forest Fridays, a conversation about conservation in the forests of Kauai, coming to you the first Friday of every month. Today's event is brought to you by Kauai Invasive Species Committee and the Kauai Forest Bird Recovery Project. My name is Kim Rogers. I work for KISC, the Kauai Invasive Species Committee. A few housekeeping tips to get started. We are in Zoom as well as pushing live to our Facebook account at KISC. We were hoping this to also push live to the Forest Bird account, but that doesn't seem to be happening. So hopefully those of you tuning in on the Forest Bird account have made your way here. Let's see, a couple things to note. This is being broadcast as a webinar feature in Zoom. So that means everybody's microphones and video are turned off. However, we would love to hear from you. So feel free to put questions in the Q&A and we'll get to answering those at some point. Also, feel free in the chat box to use that. If you have any technical issues on your end, we have people hopefully on our back end that can help with that. Halen Chalk, who is with KISC, is helping on the back end, as well as Julia Digmon, who is with the Forest Bird Project. And just to make sure we all know how to use that chat button, click on that chat button and why don't you drop in the chat where you're joining us today from, you know, whether that be your moku, your ahupua'a, the mana that might be staring at you in front of your house, your town that you're living in, maybe the stream that you're closest nearby. Let's just see where everybody is joining us from, if you wouldn't mind. Just dropping that in the chat if you're joining us from Zoom, or if you're on Facebook, drop it in as a comment feature. And I'm seeing Kaloa, I'm seeing Luai, and whoa, I love it. Hello from Los Angeles. And a neighbor of mine just from down the street in Hula is here. This is great fun. Thank you for joining us on a Friday night, kind of rainy, Pauhana time. So I would like to introduce today's topic. So for March, it is, what does a healthy forest mean to you? And at any time, if you want to drop thoughts in of what that means to you. Oh, look at this, Wisconsin. More from Wisconsin, Kalaheo. This is great. Thank you all for joining us. If you want to answer that question, please feel free to do so in the chat. What does a healthy forest mean to you? Or drop it in as a Facebook comment. Today's panelists that we have three panelists here today. One is Dr. Lisa Crampton, better known as Callie for many of us around the island, Tiffany Keaney, and Keahi Mania. Let me just give you quick introductions of each of these. And then what we're gonna do is kind of do some Q&A with each panelist. And then we're gonna take your questions. So again, if at any time you have questions, please drop them in the Q&A and we will get them to our presenters and our panelists. So let's introduce our panelists. So Callie Crampton has been the project leader with the Kauai Forest Bird Recovery Project since 2010. She oversees research into the ecology and conservation of Kauai's native forest birds. Current and recent projects include assessing the distribution and population trends of these species, studying the bird's diet and seed dispersal potential, implementing the Birds Not Rats program to control invasive rats, and determining the extent to which mosquitoes, which is a deadly vector carrying bird diseases, have invaded the Alakaʻi plateau. So Tiffany Keaney, our second panelist this evening, she has been the project manager for Kauai Invasive Species Committee since 2017. She began working at KISC, though, way back in 2009 as the outreach coordinator, working closely with the community to raise awareness on the impact of invasive species and to strengthen KISC's partnerships across the island. As KISC's project manager, she oversees island-wide early detection and rapid response projects on high priority pest species, species assessments, and prioritizations on high risk incipient plant species and long-term target plant species control programs. She's going to be telling us more about that when we chat with her. And our third panelist, give us a wave out there, Keahi Mania. Keahi started her hula study during one summer when she was 8 years of age by taking hula classes from a Navy wife at a naval air station in, of all places, Jacksonville, Florida. When she was 13, her father was transferred to Pearl Harbor and the family moved to Hawaii, where he later retired. Keahi has lived in the islands ever since. She continued hula in her early teens and again when attending the University of Hawaii. In 1978, after moving to Kauai, Keahi began hula classes in Kamakani with Roselle Bailey and was invited to join the performing team the next year. Under her direction, she was privileged to perform at Mary Monarch 3 times, as well as at the 150th anniversary of the founding of Lahaina Luna School and many other venues. After taking a decade-long break, Keahi returned to hula with Roselle and began teaching hula classes in 1996, continuing until her retirement in that capacity in 2011. She continues to serve on the board for Ka'imi Institute. So welcome to our panelists. Thank you so much for being here. We are gonna start our question and answer with Callie, Dr. Callie Crampton. And Callie, thanks for being here. Why don't we
Thank you for having us.
Fantastic. I see your audio works. We've got that figured out to unmute ourselves, right? Yeah.
Yes.
So let's start with you. What I always love to hear from people, especially in the conservation movement around Kauai, is how did you get where you are today? You know, so if you would maybe address like what motivates you to do the job that you're doing, and why did you choose conservation as your career path?
Might be easier to answer the second question first.
Take it as you wish.
I've always known that I loved the natural world, things biological. I was one of those kids that went fishing in our well for whatever might be found in our well, worms or snakes or whatever. And in college, I was struggling to find out how to marry that interest in the natural world with a desire to make the world better, to do things, to help people help. So conservation was when I found out about conservation, because it took me a while to find it, it was a really natural fit for me. And I think what continues to stoke my interest in conservation is the interconnectedness of things, and that if we help animals and plants, they will help us. And some of my answers later on will really attest to how valuable those animals and plants are to what we as humans need in this planet. So in this job, I'm really motivated by the diversity and beauty of what we call the jewels of the rainforest, which are Kauai's native forest birds. And you'll see some pictures of them in a minute, beautiful, colorful birds. And just their desire to persist and endure. The birds aren't giving up. They don't have any time to waste keeping busy being birds and getting on with things. And so why should we give up too? And so you just can never give up as a conservation biologist. There's always hope because the animals are always there. I'm also motivated by the spiritual and cultural significance of these birds to the people of the Hawaiian Islands. The birds are what brought us our beautiful feathered cloaks and our kahili, and have inspired the Hawaiian people for generations and centuries. And they continue to inspire nature lovers today with their beautiful, delightful presence. And then I'm motivated by kuleana. The birds are in trouble because of us. We created the problems that are facing the birds. And so it's our duty to address those problems on behalf of the birds.
Thank you. Yeah, so true. So would you I want to ask a follow-up. Would you go into a little bit more of detail about the relationship between the birds and the forest?
Right. So here in the Hawaiian Islands, the birds are major purveyors of what we call ecosystem services. So ecosystem services are the things that keep ecosystems going and that allow ecosystems to support life on the planet, including human life. And so here in the Hawaiian Islands, where we have no mammals and we have no reptiles, we only have birds, we really rely on the birds to provide important services like pollination, which makes sure that flowers turn into fruits, and then provide seed dispersal, which makes sure that seeds turn into shrubs and trees, and provide pest control by, like this akeke here, by eating all of the insects that would otherwise decimate our forests. And as you all probably know, without forests, the Hawaiian Islands wouldn't be the Hawaiian Islands. They wouldn't be what they are. So it's really important that we help the birds provide those services to us to keep the forest going. Pollination, shown by this apapane here, insect control, and seed dispersal to help those seeds get into the places they need to be so that they can become the next generation of forests.
So are those kind of so you recapped some great points about the importance of birds for our ecosystem here in Hawaii. Are those kind of the biological functions that the native birds are fulfilling in the forest as well? Or is there something more that you have to say about that?
I think that's what the birds do for the forest. Of course, it's really important to talk about what the forests do for the birds. And that's provide, for example, nest sites. So shown here is a tiny little nest in an ohia tree with 2 chicks in it. The forests also provide food for the birds, as we talked about with those other services, and shelter. So it's a very mutualistic relationship between the trees and the birds.
Right. Yeah. I love to make that point, you know, because it is a ecosystem, it is a life cycle, right? You know, it's a partnership and a give and we're all in it together, so to speak.
Exactly.
Yeah. I want to take a second here, and it looks like that we are up live on the Kauai Forest Bird Recovery Project Facebook page. So I want to welcome our viewers who may be joining us from there, as well as I'm hoping, fingers crossed, that we are also live on the Ka'imi Facebook page. Hopefully technology is, you know, making its way through the interwebs and making that happen. I see we have a few new panelists that have joined us from Hanalei, so welcome, and from the Ahupua'a of Kapa'a, so welcome to you both. Lastly, Callie, I just would like to hear you talk about, you know, when we talk about our forest birds, we often talk about, we have these threatened and endangered birds, but we also have some extinct species. So I was hoping that you might comment on the significance of these extinct species in the forest.
Okay, before I get there, if you don't mind, I just wanted to touch a little bit more on one of the main things that the birds do for the forest, which is make sure that we are controlling the flow of water from the misty mountains shown behind me down to the coral reefs surrounding our islands. And it's really important to understand that the birds make the forest grow, and the forest is what soaks up all those waters and then distribute the waters appropriately to our islands instead of having this muddy rushing stream or like those floods that we had in Hanalei in 2018. So we really cannot underestimate the ecosystem services provided by the birds by keeping the forest going. You know, the rain follows the forest, as we like to say. And so if we see the extinction of these species like we already have, we're already interfering with that web that's protecting our forests and our sponge and keeping the life as we know it on the Hawaiian Islands going. And unfortunately, we've already lost kama'o, which was an important seed disperser. It's much larger than the current seed dispersing species, puaiohi. And so the large seeded fruits are no longer getting well dispersed in these forests. And so those trees are falling too close to home and not falling into fertile soils. And we've also already lost, for example, the akialoa, and the nukapu'u. These were really important pollination species with their long bills reaching into the tubular lobeliads that these islands are known for. And so we're already missing some pollination services. So already our forests and our birds are on the brink, and it's fragile, and we have to really do everything we can to sustain these networks so that our plants can thrive. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, you didn't, but of course I have another one, because I was like waiting for you to go there, but it's that like there is this relationship with our native birds and our native plants, right?
Right.
And if we're losing certain native birds that are not able to then pollinate a native plant, we might lose the plant as well. Is that accurate to say?
That is accurate. So they believe that in some cases with some of the native species, the mutualism, as we call it, between the bird who was reaching into the flower for nectar and the plant, which was then dusting its pollen all over the face of the bird, those relationships were so tight that only one bird species was able to pollinate one plant species. So all it took was the bird species to go extinct and the plant species no longer had a pollinator and couldn't reproduce, or vice versa. If the plant species was wiped out by goats, say, or some other predatory species, the bird would naturally go extinct because it would have no more nectar to feed on. And so these interconnections can be so tight, and we just disrupt one little piece of it and everything can fall apart. The remaining species on Kauai have more resilience. They're a little bit more generalist. They're not as tied to one plant species, and the plant isn't as tied to one bird species. But nonetheless, these relationships still are very fragile. And we've done some studies to show that non-native species do not replace them. So for example, we all know that the Majiro or Japanese white-eye likes to feed on fruit, but it doesn't, it prefers to eat non-native fruits and not the native fruits that the native birds eat. So it's not replacing the system services that our native birds have.
And potentially even competes with our native birds.
And potentially competes with them. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Pardon, 2 minutes.
Oh, thank you. So getting a time check there. I just want to remind folks that if you have questions for Callie, feel free to either drop them in our Facebook comments box, or if you're on Zoom with us here, make your way to the Q&A and drop those in there. And we will get to them in a little bit. But because I have more questions for Callie as well, but we do have 2 more panelists we need to get to. So I think we'll shift now to Tiffany, and we can get that. There we go. So Tiffany, once we get Tiffany spotlighted.
Hello.
Hello, I'm still not quite seeing you yet. There you are. Welcome, thanks for being here. I want to ask you the same question that I started with Callie, and that is, how did you choose, or why did you choose conservation as your career path, and kind of what motivates you to do what you're doing? Because I think it's so important for our young people who may be tuning in or maybe watching this later to see the path that they can make their way potentially in conservation here on Kauai. So I'd love to hear your story.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it started with my undergraduate degree in anthropology. I've always had an interest in humans and how we're all connected to our environment and our landscape around us. So I first began working on Kauai and conservation community about 11 years ago, and that was focusing on outreach and education and giving, which really gave me the opportunity to work with different communities around the island and build these relationships. And during that time, I recognized that natural resource management or conservation programs on Kauai, or even sustainable food system programs, really need to have this combination to be successful. And that combination is community support and awareness, as well as relative science to help feed into the program, and updated policy. So that really led me to move into my master's degree, which is in environmental science and policy. And I've been really fortunate to hold a position here at KISC that I can kind of focus my effort in bridging all of those gaps to help protect Kauai from invasive species.
Great, thank you. And just as a reminder for those of us who may have joined us late, Tiffany is the project leader at the Kauai Invasive Species Committee. So speaking of the Kauai Invasive Species Committee, can you tell us what it is and maybe a little bit more about what the project does?
Sure. So KISC is a grant funding group through the University of Hawaii. We have a team of 12 employees who work to prevent, control, or eliminate the most threatening and incipient invasive species. We do this to protect Kauai's native biodiversity and minimize the ecological, agricultural, or cultural impacts that these species can have. We really serve as a gap-filling role in early detection and rapid response for priority species on the island. And we do this through partnership with the different government agencies, private and nonprofit entities. We focus our species in the species that we focus on are in the early stages of invasion before they've had a chance to become widespread and eradication is no longer possible. So for the common invasive species are not really our targets. We focus on Myconia and false kava. They're in less of a distribution on the island.
Got it, thank you. Yeah, we often get that question, right? Why aren't we dealing with the one that is pretty common? But first, before we go any further, will you just talk about what some of the different management strategies or how you deal with these invasive species, and especially, tonight we're talking about the forest. So as it relates to the forest.
Yeah, it's a good question. So first, I should say that there's 4 different management strategies in controlling invasive species, if it's in the forest or in the marine area. And I should note that not all non-native species will become invasive. They have to have a certain amount of characteristics to be invasive and ultimately cause some type of harm. We'll talk tonight about specifically harming the forest or our watershed area. And a good example is that seen in these pictures here. The first one is the most effective control program is really to prevent the species from becoming established and causing harm. That can be seen with an example of the brown tree snake here by one of our employees. This is not a picture taken on Kauai, don't worry. This was when he was training down in Guam with brown tree snakes, but it's to prevent the species from even coming here. It's a little bit easier said than done. So the next example is more prevention and early detection. And that would be the mongoose example on the right. And so we caught 3 different mongoose on Kauai, I think 2012 and 2016. And we did an entire island-wide species assessment to see if there was a breeding population, and it was determined there wasn't. So how we're going to continue to monitor that or control that species is to respond to any new sightings of mongoose. Next, we kind of move into early detection and rapid response and control. A good example of this is rapid ohia death. You can see in the pictures that she has up. Those brown spots, one of them are circled, is an ohia tree that's suspected of being infected by the pathogen that causes rapid ohia death. And for us to go out there and find these species, why they're in smaller distribution and newer than a more common species, but we're not preventing them from coming to the island. They're already here. So we're going out there and responding to them and figuring out if the ohia tree is infected by that species, and then what management strategies we can put in and what tools we have in our toolbox to stop the species from spreading. Oh, there's an example of us going out there and surveying the tree to see, because we have to send the wood chips to see if there's a pathogen is in the ohia tree. Then another example would be Myconia. This one's a little bit more different in our early detection or control phase of this. It's only in one area on the island, and the ultimate goal is to contain it from spreading and then eradicate it before it has a large impact. So it's going to be in that area, and we have to go, there's a good example of that large impact of a forest with just Myconia and nothing else. And we want to prevent that from happening. So we go and search the area and remove it so it doesn't spread. And then we move into those widespread species, which would be more of those common species: strawberry guava, African tulip, Australian tree fern, these albizia, these examples that most people are probably listening to us are more familiar with. These are widespread, and they're likely not going to be eradicated from the island. So it moves into a management strategy where a lot of people think of as restoration, where we focus on removing that invasive species from a high value, pristine habitat before it has a chance to impact them. So a lot of around the bird habitat that Callie just spoke about, there's a lot of effort to go around and remove very select species that have a high impact on those birds.
Yeah, and I know we're talking about forests and primarily tonight, but these invasive species can be found where on the island?
Everywhere, from Mako to Makai. Invasive species can be found everywhere. And I guess the best way of saying early detection and prevention are the ones that are lower, we kind of think of to protect our forests, is to stop them from escaping our backyard and moving into the forest area. Because some species get here from ornamental trade or different things like that.
Right. Yeah, no, I think it's important for people to know, right? Even our pristine forested areas where our forest birds are, there are invasives or, non-native, potentially invasives that are making their way up there. And that is clearly something we want to stop and prevent from happening. So what can we do about that? What's the message that KISC has? Because I know personally, because I've been up there myself, that we have a lot of these boot brush stations, that have popped up at trailheads around the island. So can you just talk to the importance of them, why we have them, and why they're important?
Sorry, just to interrupt, 2 minutes, sorry.
Oh, no problem.
Perfect.
Thank you, Monica.
Perfect timing. So biosanitation is really important, because what biosanitation is, it's the individual's way of managing an invasive species on our island. It's what the individual can do to help prevent a further impact. You're removing the dirty soil or mud from the bottom of your boots, as you can see in these boot brush stations right here. When you're hiking in one area, you're picking up small seeds or pathogens or things you really can't see that are hiding in the mud. And biosanitation or cleaning your boots and decontaminating would be removing that and preventing it from spreading to another area. For example, Wailua hiking to going up to Cocai and hiking there. We want to stop that. So biosanitation is how the individual manages invasive species.
Great, thank you. And I want to pause and recognize we've got some more people that have joined us on Facebook from where did I see? Princeville Resort of all places, up north. So thank you for joining us. Yeah, and let's see, I've seen some comments in the chat. So yes, you're seeing those boot brush stations all over Cocai. We're trying to get them out at trailheads that are maintained trailheads across the island. The newest one was just installed like a week ago today, I want to say, at a Kolahau Trail, which is in Honolulu on the Honolulu National Wildlife Refuge. So that's a brand spanking new one. And I like, Tiffany, how you mentioned that, you know, it's KISC's, you know, mission, right? Kauai Invasive Species Committee, but that we can all take a role in helping prevent, you know, the movement or the introduction of invasive species. And I loved how you said that, you know, with the use of these boot brushes, for example. So yeah, now I think we're gonna probably have run out of time. Thank you, Monica. And we're gonna talk to our third panelist. And I'm just gonna remind people, if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the Facebook comment box or drop them in the Q&A if you're joining us here on Zoom. And I think what we're gonna do first though is watch a video, right? I see nodding. Okay, so I think somebody behind the scenes, Magical Elves, Menehune, is gonna start a video for us to watch. I'm not hearing sound. There we go.
It's referring to the birds that are close to extinction. So that's why I cry during that part. But then it's wake up, all us people who take care of the birds.
Thank you. That video showed pretty good on my end. I hope it did for everybody else as well. So Keahi Mania joining us from Kaimi Institute. We heard in your introduction earlier a little bit about your bio, personal bio that is. So I'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to unmute yourself. I'd love to hear about your relationship with KISC and Kauai Forest Bird Recovery Project and how that came to be. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. Thank you, Julia, for that beautiful video introduction. Thank you. For the past 10 plus years, our Hawaiian Cultural Group has provided seasonal blessings for the Forest Bird Recovery Project and other conservation groups that work in Cocai. The original blessing was requested by Dr. Crampton as their project staff were getting ready to release critically endangered Kauai puaiohi into the forest. The birds had been raised in captivity with their release intended to improve the survival of the Cocai puaiohi. The project staff wanted every possible advantage to the released birds, including a Hawaiian blessing. So we provided a ceremony. It was first held in the area of Cocai of the forest where our Hula group previously adopted this area some years before through a formal agreement with DLNR to remove invasive species and plant natives in the area. We call it Pohaku Hula. We had an established relationship already with Katie Castle and the Cocai Resource Conservation people, because they would accompany us on our work days and provided plants for us for reforestation in this small area that we adopted. And invasive species committee people began to attend work days as more agencies and volunteers were invited. And it developed into an annual event, and it's meant a really lot. The association has meant a lot to us. Yeah. Callie talked about the scientific and environmental aspects of the relationship between the birds and the people. So just keep this in mind too. By extension, the cultural aspects means there are names of winds, and there are names of rains, and names of mists, and there's certain environmental situations, that involve the rains and the winds, that have names. They have specific names. And through our work, chanting and dancing, and through Hula, through the old chants, and through things that we are inspired to make up now, those wind and rain names, those, as they associate in the forest, are maintained, they're preserved. Some are endangered, and some are extinct. Some are forgotten. There are many of the wind and names, rain names that are forgotten already. And so, but the cultural extension is to keep those alive, as well as all the interchanging aspects of the forest.
You know, that's super interesting. I had not really thought, we think so much when we think about extinction here in Hawaii, we oftentimes think about flora and fauna. And at one time, like even the Hawaiian language was close to extinction. Obviously, part and parcel with that would have been these words that you're talking about, of the rain and the forest and the winds. Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. You just sort of blew my mind, or at least opened it up a little bit more. Yeah. So thank you for sharing that. I think you were also hitting on something I also would love to hear from you talk about, and that is, how do you go about selecting, what to present as part of the blessing, either the chant or the hula? How do you go about, putting that together and making that happen?
Well, mahalo to our kumu, the people who came before us. So there's a very specific order. There's flexibility within that, but there's an order that we go through that's basic. The blessing begins with prayer to Akua first. Then greetings are called out to the ancestors. We call this aloha tato, good hello to everyone, greetings to everyone. Ancestors of the people who attend, as well as the ancestors of the others who have presence there, who have been there before us, those ancestors. Then there are chants that identify and give credence to those who are present at the time during the event, why they're there and what their intentions are. There are hula deities who are manifested in the flora and in the fauna, who are honored and called upon for inspiration. It's all about the inspiration that we've all talked about that already. Hula are performed that request life and growth, and recognize place names, recognize the names of winds and mists and specific phenomena, how birds interact with ohia. Those things are all in those chants, and the environmental phenomena of the area. Collaborating conservation groups that are present during the blessing are asked to state their goals out loud, their aspirations for the season. And everyone who's listening helps to affirm those goals for the place. And it's specific to, what are your goals for this season? This is a seasonal blessing, so what do you want to do this year? So all of us hear that. So it's a form of education as well, yeah, not just affirming, So let's see, the more hula and oli that have been inspired by the relationships with the conservation efforts are then presented, and a prayer request for continued inspiration and growth. And then the ceremony ends with an oli that says, Ualulu kamaile. The maile seeds have been scattered. That's basically the seed, and these seeds will grow and produce. So seeds in many different, looking at seeds in many different ways. The seeds of knowledge that are out there, the seeds of what we're doing in the forest to keep the birds growing, to keep the forest healthy, pulling the weeds to keep the natives growing. Those are all the different seeds that are being scattered.
I love it. Thank you. I was honored to be able to be in attendance last week during the blessing, and it was a lovely session and experience. And I also was able to, for a brief moment, join your group out in the forest where you've adopted this area of the forest that I know you call the Pohaku Hula site. And you've spent years removing invasives and weeds and outplanting. And it was lovely to see this little pocket of the forest that it definitely has a different energy and a feel to it when you're in there versus, 100 yards away where there's a lot of strawberry guava or Himalayan ginger. And it's just this beautiful pocket of forest and years worth of work. And I thank you for doing that. But I'd also like to hear why you chose that spot.
2 minutes.
During the 70s and 80s, our Kumu Roselle Bailey took our hula students to this place to teach us how to recognize and collect hula plants. So this was our classroom. As we got older and more scattered and some moved away, the ones who were living here on Kauai decided that we needed to begin to malama the area, because there was a lot of invasion. So what we're doing is pulling the common weeds. We're engaged in pulling the ginger and the guava and the blackberry, blah, blah, blah. It's a small spot, but we are engaged in that. So I'd like to challenge other groups to follow along, do what we're doing, and try to adopt an area and work with that area to pull off this work.
Thank you.
It's very, very rewarding, very rewarding.
It's beautiful. Yeah, it's got to be so rewarding. And for those of us joining us on Zoom, my colleagues behind the scenes have been dropping in a whole bunch of links in the chat for you. Keahi generously wrote and donated a book to Kauai Forest Bird Recovery Project. There's a link in the Zoom for that. There's also a link to the Kaimi website, which is kaimi.org. And I have one last question for you, and I know we're short on time, but and you maybe have already answered this question, but is there anything more you might want to say about how the native birds and native plants inspire your hula?
Oh, yeah. Well, we decorate ourselves with those plants. That's all of those mauka plants have meaning for hula people, but in many, many, many different ways. But our association with the Forest Bird Recovery Project in the beginning, we wrote chants, we wrote original music, original chants, and hulas related to puaiohi, related to akike'e, akikiki, and we performed them out in public in many different places. And so that's how we've been inspired by the association with the Forest Bird Recovery Project in KISC and Katie and Resource Conservation. So it's been put into practice and taken out into the hula community. That's been our way to educate people about it. Inspiration, it's about that.
Yeah, and I just love how, these three particular organizations, and there's more. You mentioned KRCP, there's many more, but I love how, it seems like in conservation, it really takes a village, right? That old saying. And so, we've got cultural groups, we've got conservation groups, endangered forest birds and Kauai Invasive Species Committee. I mean, everybody working together to, maintain and create this lush biodiversity that's found in our native forests. So important for all of us, because a healthy forest, is going to mean a healthy reef that we can go swimming in, nice clean water, or we can go fishing in. A healthy forest also means we have, drinking water. So yeah, I just love how everybody's coming together. I have one last question. I'm going to do a round robin for each one of our panelists. And I'm going to again remind everybody, if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A if you're joining us on Zoom, or if you're joining us on Facebook, drop them in the comment box. But my last question, I'm going to ask each one of you, and I'm going to start and go in the same rotation. So Callie, The question is, what does a healthy forest mean to you?
So from the bird perspective, a healthy forest is one that provides suitable habitat for the native birds. And that means all the invertebrates that they need to eat, and the fruit that they need to eat, and the flowers they need to pollinate, and the places they need to build their nests. And this is so, as I mentioned earlier, in turn, the birds can help us by providing those really important ecosystem services. And together, the forest can flourish and provide inspiration, as Keahi's been talking about, for generations to come, and ecosystem services to keep life going here in the Hawaiian Islands. And it's really important to understand that here in Hawaii, we've been talking about a lot of invasive species. Those invasive species, mongoose and snakes, but we haven't really touched yet upon the rats and the cats that are really big deals to the birds, are threatening that balance in our native forests. And so to have a healthy forest, we have to work on controlling those non-native species so that the birds can have this habitat, and we can continue to have that beautiful ecosystem balance. And we must also remove, early on, we talked really briefly about mosquitoes, which vector deadly diseases to the birds. So they, in particular, to vector a disease called avian malaria, which is to the birds is like COVID in older people. It just causes them to drop like flies. And so those things are tipping the balance against the native species. So a healthy forest is one that these days, unfortunately, is being managed actively by us and our partners to provide the inspiration, the spiritual solace, the cultural connectivity, and the ecosystem services that we count on here in the Hawaiian Islands.
Thank you. Thank you. And Tiffany, same question to you. What does a healthy forest mean to you?
I think my answer is going to be very similar to Callie's. So I guess to add on to Callie's answer is that a healthy forest is really rich in biodiversity, and that biodiversity or ecosystem services that she was talking about is really what helps recharge our water resources and sustains our natural resources here on Kauai. And so to have a healthy forest really means that we're maintaining our watershed. We're preventing erosion and runoff in the streams and sedimentation on our reefs. If we don't have a healthy forest, we're not going to have an entire water system on Kauai. And I think that that's the main reason for invasive species impacts on that. And that has to do with the whole balance, is because we need biodiversity and very rich biodiversity for those birds, as well as all of the insects and trees that are there.
Thank you. You know, I think what used to surprise me so much about the forest is, you know, how these invasive species, be them plant or animal, you know, like Callie mentioned, cats and rats and even mosquitoes, you know, how they made their way to the upper reaches of our forest on our island where humans don't live. I mean, humans may go to, but yet they do invade our forests. So that kind of, it took me a minute, right, to get my head around. And I'm like, oh yeah, of course. But let me ask the same question now. What does a healthy forest mean to you of Keahi?
As Hula people, we depend on the forest for the plants we use for adornment. So that's, and of course, it's ditto to what my colleagues are saying, so I won't repeat that. What I would like to say is that, you know, I challenge our Hula Kumu and our Haumana to consider adopting an area of the forest to Malama. The flora and the fauna are interconnected. Absence of one species affects the balance of all the others. I mentioned the winds and the rains and the forgetting the place names. But, you know, as we tend to, Hula people, we tend to focus on the plants, but you have to recognize how interconnected everything is. So that's my challenge. I challenge people to find out a way to work with other groups and adopt an area in the forest, and actually go in and pull out that blackberry and pull out that ginger and see what it feels like to have a little area of the forest that's really clean and fresh, and what belongs there is there. And you've helped to do that, even if it's a small area. It's very educational for young people to go to work in a situation like that.
Thank you. Thank you. That's like music to my ears. And
Yeah.
I wanna put a shout out to anybody who's interested in making that happen and you just don't quite know where to turn. Reach out to us at KISC, Kauai Invasive Species Committee, and we would be happy to give you some ideas or put you in touch with some people who you can partner with. You know, the Cocai Resource Conservation Program that's been mentioned here, they do a lot of service work in Cocai. And, you know, obviously once things get better with COVID and we're out and about doing more things in the public, hopefully more of those service projects will be available to us all. So anybody out there listening, feel free to reach out to Kauai Invasive Species Committee. Go ahead, Keahi.
Yeah, and you know, I noticed we got people from Wisconsin, Los Angeles, other places. So it's not just here in your area. The same thing is happening in your area. You know, there are places in your area where you can go and you can help your native plants survive and thrive. So, you know, do it there. Yep. This is a global thing, not just here. It's, you know, we all know it's everywhere.
Yeah. So we want to ask the same question to our viewers that we've been addressing tonight. And that question is, what does a healthy forest mean to you? So Halen has set up this, what's called Mentimeter question. So she's going to drop that for those of you on Zoom. She's going to drop that in our chat box, and there's a link that you can click on, and that'll take you to this page, this web page called Mentimeter. So it's there already. She's already done it. So if you would click on that. Now, for those of you on Facebook, Halen, if you could drop it in the KISC Facebook account, that would be great. And Julia, if you could drop it in the Forest Bird Facebook page as well, so that all those folks can be joining us and answering the question. Thank you. I see it made its way to KISC's Facebook page. And I think Halen is gonna show how this works. So it's like an online word cloud. So you can drop a word in, what does the forest mean to you? And we can see how everybody is responding to it. And I'm gonna do it too. And let's see, it's taken a second to pull up. It might take a second or two for everybody to get to the page and see how it works. And Halen, if you want to pop on and give some further instructions, since you're more familiar with this than I am, feel free. Because it's popped up on my page, but I'm not seeing. Do I have to log in or sign up? I'm a little confused, Halen. And if you're speaking, I can't hear you because you might be on mute.
So just go ahead and go to menti.com, which is right up here at the top of the screen, the share screen, and use the code 15988070. And that'll take you to this particular Mentimeter.
It's still not working for me. Looks like you got to sign up.
Did you try going to menti.com? Just the www.menti.com?
Menti or Mentimeter?
Menti.
Oh.
MENTI.com.
Yep. Okay, I'm at menti.com. You might want to drop that in the chat for other folks. And then what's the number that I put in?
15988070.
15988070. Don't know if that's working for anybody else. I got there. Ooh, now the challenge is, what's the word? What does a healthy forest mean to you? Okay, I was able to make it work. I see a couple other people have made it work as well. So that's good. why don't we can leave that and people can be, oh, I love it. See how it's refreshing? Oh, I love this. Okay, climate stability, biodiversity, connection, inspiration, beauty, life. Oh, Opu, I like that. Peace. This is fun. See, when it works, it's fun. I love it. Well, we can keep that going, right, Halen? And then we can
going as we answer questions as well.
And then we'll come back to it.
Yep. So
okay. What do you got question-wise for us?
Just a moment. Let me try and pull that up real quick. Actually, I don't know if I'll be able to do that while it's open. It should be in the Q&A, Kim.
Yeah, I've got one for you.
Okay.
Does anyone know where Ho'ohie forest, mentioned in a chant Ka'imi students learn, was or is? So this might be a Keahi question. And maybe you can, Halen, stop sharing that screen and put all of the panelists on so everybody can see everybody. And Keahi?
No, I'm not aware of where Ho'ohie is. I don't know where that is.
That's one of those, like you were pointing out earlier.
My knowledge maybe is just not broad enough. There may be others who have more knowledge of place names than I do.
I think one of your Hula sisters asked the question.
Yeah, it was one of our Kumu that asked that. Nope, I don't know where.
I tried to answer the other question about invasive species, but I'm not sure I interpreted it correctly. I tried to answer it in the chat.
Well, in the chat or in the Q&A? It looks like Q&A.
Let me Q&A.
Yeah, let's just ask this of Tiffany since it's invasive species. Are any of these invasive species secondary to man, or are they, I'll say, quote, natural for lack of a better word?
I didn't see what Callie's answer is, but I'm assuming it's correct, Callie. So all of the invasive species are non-native to the area that they're considered invasive. So they are introduced. And when we say introduced, it means came with the help of humans. If that's unintentional, like it was a hideaway on a plane, like rats on a boat or snakes on a plane, or if it was on purpose because they brought it into their yard and it unfortunately escaped and started spreading and showing its invasive characteristics. I think that's answering the question.
I also added about invasiveness versus being non-native and not invasive.
Yes, so not all introduced species that man introduced are invasive. It has to have those characteristics that will cause it to take over or spread harm. Mosquitoes, rats, we've talked about, as well as certain types of plants.
But for example, I was just thinking about roses here on Kauai don't seem to be particularly invasive. If you plant one in your garden, it stays in your garden and you don't sort of see them wandering up the street the way when people planted Himalayan ginger by a cabin, it took over the forest. So there are differences in the capability for invasion that depend both on the species, I think, and on the environment that's receiving that species, right?
Yes.
One example could be the plums up in Cocai. So that's an invasive introduced species, was introduced on purpose for the fruit. And it spread somewhat, but it's not considered a danger, right? Doesn't invade to the point where it's a problem.
Yeah, a lot of our fruit that is introduced on the island, because we harvest it, right? So the seeds don't spread far and wide because we use those seeds. They don't tend to have those invasive characteristics because they don't spread. We eat them before they have a chance.
Yeah.
So related to this question in the chat, Kim and Jeff responded, could it not be introduced from birds flying in from other countries?
That's a great question. Yeah, it can be introduced. It doesn't have to just be humans, but generally when we think of the 3 W's in Hawaii, wind, wings, and waves, how our native species got here, and if they got here on the wings of a bird naturally on their own, we don't think of them, we think of them as native. They wouldn't be invasive.
Yeah, interesting question though, because you know, potentially we do have migratory birds coming in and out, so potentially something could be brought in. Whoops.
Oh yeah, there's a good example with aquatic species. They do aquatic species from one stream to another, or from one island to another. The birds can get algae or aquatic ferns that are invasive and spread them around.
Great discussion. Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Kim and Jeff, for adding to that. I'm looking now over on the KISC Facebook page, and I've got a couple comments that I'll just share. One is from Karen, who, I agree, Karen. She says funding needs to be able to keep the rubbing alcohol spray bottles full at Loop Road and Powerline Trail. Tiffany, do you want to just, you know, respond to that?
Yes, I agree. We always need more funding to help protect our native forests.
But a secondary issue, isn't it, that is just during COVID, it's been very difficult for anybody to get their hands on rubbing alcohol. So that's
right.
That is true.
Right.
We donated.
It's not going to happen right now.
We donated a half bottle to the New Ololo Trail when we left the other day.
Aw, thank you.
Thank you.
I was out looking for you guys, but you were too far ahead of me, and I was on a timeline. I had to get back.
But also people need to remember that they can take a bottle of alcohol with them whenever they go. It's a matter of education. It's a matter of taking personal responsibility. And, you know, we need to know that we need to do that and spread the word so that others do it, so that we, you know, it's on our boots, it's on our tires. So
wow, what a beautiful sentiment. Thank you for that. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's on us.
I want to ask Julia if, or maybe Monica is monitoring any questions on the Kauai Forest Bird Recovery Project Facebook page. Are there anything floating in there that we want to talk about?
I don't see any questions.
Yeah, no questions. However, there is a comment, and I can read it to you. Birds are so important for seed dispersals and pollination. Seed dispersal and pollination are imperative for the continuation of trees in the forest. And of course, we would have no clean water downstream without trees. Thank you, forest birds.
Aw, you can always read those comments.
It was my comment, so I was like, oh, I'll just skip over it.
Monica, thank you. And if somebody has, you know, flying fingers and can on Facebook go to the Keahi page, I would love to just take a quick look-see there if we have any comments or questions on that one. Meanwhile, while you're doing that, I will address a comment from Karen as well on the KISC Facebook page, who is looking for some signage at the Kaluapuhi Trail. And you're right, there potentially does need to be signage there. Unfortunately, that is not in our kuleana, but I would, not, where would we direct her on that? Anybody have any idea?
Not Alahele,
right?
State parks or not Alahele.
Yeah, I don't think that's a Alahele trail though, is it?
Well, it's kind of complicated because not Alahele helps maintain trails everywhere. So
do they? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say state parks. Not Alahele.
That is one of the few trails I know of that is exclusively within the state park. Many of the other trails start in state parks and then very rapidly become forestry land. So it's very complicated. Yeah. But
okay.
DNLR, either state parks or not Alahele.
Yeah. Any other questions anybody sees out there that we want to address? Otherwise, I'd love to see what our word cloud looks like again. Halen, if you want to pop that up.
Just a moment. Okay, cool.
And you'll keep that, right? That will preserve, that yes. Won't go away, right? I love it. So we've got bird song, beautiful. Isolation, I like that. That's kind of goes in that peace category, right? We go up there to kind of get away from it all and to have quiet and peace and connection, alive, renewal, relaxing, inspiration, client stability, wildlife, oopu, life, diversity, and beauty. That's fun. I'm glad that we figured that out. Mm-hmm. And I see there's perhaps one more question. Can you give an update on rapid ohia death on Kauai? How bad and where is it? So I'll take that question since that is is my kuleana. Rapid ohia death has been detected on the north, south, east sides of our island, and most recently in the Cocai area. However, I put a little asterisk by that. It is not as pervasive on this island as it is on Hawaii Island, where it was first detected, where over 1 million trees have been known to have died from this disease. On Kauai, we're looking at, give or take, about 250 trees. That said, that is definitely has a lot of eyes and ears and people working on it, because ohia, we like to refer to as the most abundant and perhaps even most important tree in our native forest. So it is concerning. We are working on it. It sort of leads into our last thing that we have to share, right, Halen?
Mm-hmm.
And this is a segment we're calling Faces of the Forest. It runs about 60 seconds, maybe a little bit over. So in addition to this monthly program that we're doing, Forest Fridays, we're also doing a project called Faces of the Forest, and it will feature a specific individual species within the forest and or an individual who is working in our forest, basically to save our forests. So our first one is actually devoted to ohia, and I can talk over this. You can just, hit play anytime. And we'll start sharing this on social media and other places. But this one is dedicated to ohia as our very first Faces of the Forest. And a little bit of history, ohia is our forest foundation. It is one of the first plants to start growing after a fresh lava flow. It can grow up to 100 feet and live for almost 1,000 years. It has the potential for that. It is known as a keystone species in our forest because it provides a home to many other species, be that critical habitat for endangered or threatened forest birds, be it over 500 arthropods that have been found in our forest canopies. An estimated 350 million ohia grow across Hawaii. It is key to our watershed. Ohia has strong cultural ties here in Hawaii. We talked about hula. It also has ties to medicine, to construction, to va'a, canoes. Unfortunately, there's this threat known as rapid ohia death, which is a fungus, and at this point in time is deadly. Once a tree gets it, unfortunately, it's just a matter of time before it succumbs. So this is where we get to, we need your help, and that's using our boot brushes that we talked about, using rubbing alcohol, but in addition, removing the mud, not just from your boots, but as well from any vehicles that you take into the forest. And the last thing you can do to save ohia is to not wound ohia. So that means don't break branches, scuff up roots, because that is how the disease enters the tree. It's through wounds. That's how this microscopic pathogen gets in. Wow, that was a nice lead in to our Faces of the Forest, wasn't it? So yeah, I think we're, are we all on gallery view? So we're all panelists now maybe, and we can all just turn off our unmute buttons. I don't see any more questions that have come in, but if there have been some, feel free to speak up. Otherwise, let's try and get all of our faces on so we can wish everybody a good Pauhana Friday. I see, oh, yeah, we did everything, right, Halen?
Yep, we got everything.
Okay, I'm just seeing Halen.
It's the speaker view still.
Oh,
now
weird.
I'm seeing you.
Have to go to gallery view and you see everybody.
I thought I was in gallery view.
On Facebook, it's gallery view.
Is it? Fantastic. All right, well then everybody just, ahui ho, join us then for our next month, which will be the first Friday in April. And we are gonna talk about how do we protect forests for our children's future. So we look forward to seeing you in April. And thank you so much for being here. Ahui ho.
Ahui ho.
Ahui ho.
Aloha.
Aloha.